We are speaking with Andreas Bummel, who is the founder of Democracy Without Borders and behind the international campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly. We'll be talking about his ideas on UN reform and world government, as well as his book that was published recently, A World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century. Thanks for coming on the Geopolitics and Empire podcast, Andreas.
Thanks so much for having me, Rovia.
Now, this is the first time that I broached this topic on geopolitics and empire. It's an interesting topic. I don't think people talk much about it, but it's this idea of world government that goes back for many thousands of years, millennia, as you write in your book. And one of the examples that you talk about is the Chinese dynasties that 3,000 years ago they had this idea of Tianxia, which means everything under heaven. And that the idea that the Chinese emperor unites and rules the world as the son of heaven. And there are many other iterations going back to the Greeks and so on. But it seems that only in recent centuries, the realization of a world state has become closer to reality, and that today in our present age, some might say the very first time in history that a true world parliament is possible thanks to technology, globalization, integration, as well as the possibilities of extinction, and which you talk about in your book. And some of the names you mentioned, some of the proponents surprised me. They included Henry Ford, Albert Camus, Friedrich von Hayek, Albert Einstein, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., the Catholic Church since 1951. So can you tell us a little bit about why is today different than any previous moment in history?
Well, thanks again for having me today and for pointing out the long history and tradition of the idea of a democratic world parliament. In fact, I think it is noteworthy, the people you mentioned, they actually cover the whole political spectrum, with the exception perhaps of obviously the nationalistic far right. And the idea has been around for such a long time, based on an understanding, and you refer to it, that all humankind is one family. And we can find that actually in all cultures across the world regions, including in Africa. Ubuntu concept, is relevant in this regard. And why is it most relevant today? I mean, obviously, that's because global interdependence has come to a degree, to a level worldwide that is actually putting humanity at risk. And actually, it also means that whatever action you take as an individual or as a group somewhere on the globe potentially affects everybody else on the planet. And this concerns, obviously, first of all, the question of, or the problem rather, of climate change. Carbon dioxide knows no borders, it just frees slowly in the atmosphere. So there are many global common goods of this kind that actually affect everybody and on which we have an impact as individuals, as nations, and other groups. So this makes it a urgent necessity actually for us as humankind to rethink the ways we govern this world. And so we have this one starting point, which is, I would say, philosophy or empathy for your fellow human being. But the other thing is this actual obvious necessity that global governance, that's the bottom line, has been failing with the system we have today.
And, the topic of world parliament or world government is something that I think is not on the mind of the average citizen around the world. You talk to most people, well, I think a lot of people, they won't know what you're talking about. And the concept has a variety of names. Sometimes I could get confused. I don't even know what to call it. You call it world parliament. There's global governance, global government, world state, so on. What should we call it if we talk about definitions? And could you describe this concept for us? Is there a singular version, or can it come in many different acceptable variations?
Well, this is, first of all, and from my perspective, amazing actually, that the idea that we need to make a leap forward in how the world is governed is not mainstream, or at least it's not yet mainstream. Look at the climate protest strike movement and others who are dealing with global problems, including nuclear disarmament or global pandemics and all. It's actually very amazing to me that this topic is actually not coming up. But just one short remark on the history, because this has not been like this all the time. Immediately after the Second World War, or during the First and the Second World War, there was a broad popular movement for world government. And I think at the time, it's also laid out in the book, at the time, I mean, it was popular because people individually themselves, they just felt the impact of war, of full-scale war and mass murder. So they were rethinking whether nationalism, which was the root problem, is really what should lead that in the future. And they concluded that's not the case. So if we talk about terms, this is very important, because terms, I think, they actually describe what you are talking about. And global governance and global government, to start with this, that are, I would say, two completely different things. Governance refers to some multi-level, informal structure involving different kind of stakeholders and actors. It's very fluid and intransparent. That's what governance is about. And global governance does not actually question the setup of our, today's international law and the international system, which is based on national sovereignty in principle, and governing the world with 193 nominally sovereign entities is just the problem. It doesn't work. So that's governance. And of course, I'm very brief now. There are, meters and meters of literature about what that is, global governance, or what it is not. But in my view, it is really different from government, which then describes, by contrast, a formalized way how decisions are being taken. Partly it's also hierarchical, So this refers then to principles in government like federalism or subsidiarity that come into play that do not necessarily play a role in governance approaches. So you have a clear structure in government, who does what and who has what responsibility and who is taking what decisions with what legitimacy. So of course, there are many more terms. Perhaps you can point out which ones are now of most interest to you in this interview. Others refer to, of course, the World Parliament. And here we have often, I think, synonymous terms like, a global parliament and the World Parliament is essentially the same. Or if you speak about a world federation, from my point of view, a federation automatically implies that you have a democratic system. So, yeah, but it's important to be clear about what we are talking about.
And, there's been a lot of talk of transforming the UN into a world government, as your book says. And is this reform of the UN possible or even desirable, or would it be better to establish an entirely new world federal organization?
Right. The UN, its basic structures were born out, obviously, out of the situation at the end of the Second World War, with the 5 veto powers and the permanent members at the same time. It was also decided at the time to take a functional approach, meaning that if some issue came up, a new organization was established. So to be more precise, we could be talking about the UN system, which is composed of like 40 or more programs, specialized agencies, and so on. So it's a larger system. But if we talk about the core organization, really, I believe that moving forward to a system of global government, right, we should really consider using what already exists. And so I would argue that the core organization of the UN, which is pretty small actually, but still it exists, and it actually already represents the embryonic starting point of the world executive. So I don't think that parallel structures and duplication is really the way forward. And besides, the reality is, even if we were able to establish a new organization in parallel, this new organization, in my opinion, would deal with the same problems. we are dealing with problems of, a geopolitical nature, the competition of nation states, that is ingrained in our international law system of today. So even if we had the opportunity to create a new world community of sorts, those problems wouldn't go away unless it would really be a leap forward, like we are trying to portray it in the book, a leap forward to a democratic world system. But if such a system is effectively to address global issues, it should be universal, right? So there are proposals out there that have become a little bit more prominent more recently, like a community of democracies and sort of organizations of that kind. But okay, I mean, how would a community just as a scenario of 40 or 50 countries be able to address, for instance, the problem of potential global pandemics? Yes, so actually we have, weak links then en masse, and that's something we need to avoid.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, well, the concert of democracies and something called the Democracies 10. So just to clarify, there are no proposals for an entirely new world federation. All of them are looking to, I guess, work together with the UN system?
Well, I mean, there are many, many, many initiatives and proposals in academia and elsewhere on world order questions. So certainly there are also proposals to, move forward in parallel or alternatively to the UN, to the existing UN. However, the question remains how to deal with the existing world organization that we have. So this is something that is largely unaddressed in all those models. So those are blueprints that are not really, in my opinion, rooted in the reality we live in. But of course, such models do exist.
Something interesting for me are, the numerous regional unions or regional integrations that exist, starting with the EU. We have the African Union, the South American Union, UNASUR, or you have Mercosur. And interestingly, the Colombian president, Ivan Duque, recently proposed PROSUR. So there's a lot of fun there. There's a lot of competition. We have ASEAN, the Southeast Asian Union, the Eurasian Economic Union, which I'm guessing is going along those same lines, looking forward to a Eurasian Union. They've been discussing a common currency in these parts here where I am. I've read about a proposed Middle Eastern Union and so forth. And in your book, I didn't know until I read it, you mentioned that the BRICS are discussing a common parliament as well. So what role would these kind of regional interparliamentary institutions have within a world parliament?
Right. This is a topic that is often being overlooked, not only by mainstream, but even in academia, that we do have those regional integration processes. And those processes, they actually, by now, almost all of them include parliamentary bodies. And just to stress that again, one of my main jobs, actually day-to-day jobs, is to coordinate the international campaign for a UN Parliamentary Assembly, which would be just the first step towards a democratic world parliament. So we need to look at it from, the view that it is a process that will start with the first step and then develop over time. The democratically elected world parliament is the vision that you pursue. And certainly we want to achieve as much as possible, as quickly as possible. But realistically, there will be a first pragmatic step because obstacles are very, very large. And then this institution will grow. And now back to your question about the regional integration approaches and organizations. Here is exactly, a spot where we can find models and examples how such parliamentary bodies have been working elsewhere. There's no such thing in the UN system or globally at all. There is no global body of parliamentarians, for instance, for the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund or anywhere in the UN system. And this is amazing. But At the regional level, there are many. The Pan-African Parliament, for instance, represents the African citizens in addition to the governments in the African Union. We have the Parlatino, which is a parliamentary body for Latin America. Of course, we should also mention the European Parliament, which is the most developed of these institutions, which is actually a real powerhouse by now, and the European elections are just in a week or so. And this is actually, you know, the European Parliament more important than any national parliament. This is something that many, even in Europe, don't realize, right? That by now, over a decades-long development, the European Parliament is not just setting really the agenda on many, many topics in Europe. Well, and now the point is, if we imagine how a UN Parliamentary Assembly or World Parliament can function, we can be informed by looking at those examples, right? And in a larger picture of global integration, because I believe a parliamentary body of this kind will be or should be an engine for global integration based on common values in a democratic way. So those parliamentary bodies in the continental regional associations are engines of regional integration as well. Like in the Pan-African Parliament, they would discuss, for instance, the upcoming African Free Trade Area, which will be launched in 7 days also, or other things. And those are people, you know, they are not the executive. They are free to speak their minds in principle. So this is important. And in Europe, that has been important too. And this is exactly what's missing globally, right? At the global scale, at the UN scale, it's really all intergovernmental. And foreign ministries across the world, wherever you go, the diplomats, the career diplomats, they are hesitant to accept the fact that in our time, it is no longer sufficient that a whole country is represented by a single diplomat, right? Because today, the distinction between foreign policy and domestic policy is blurred, right? We have one world domestic policy, issues that affect everybody. So a larger spectrum needs to be represented in intergovernmental negotiations, and we can see how this plays out regionally.
And can you just give us just kind of a visualization, because this is all kind of it's quite confusing. But I mean, would it look like in the onion if we had a world parliament where we still have like our national parliament or government existing simultaneously with the regional union or parliament, and then finally with the world parliament? Would it kind of look like that? Would they all three systems be necessary?
Yes. Sure. I think that what we are talking about eventually is a system of multi-level government. So there are levels of government already. They start at the local scale, then let's go to the subnational regional scale between the provinces in federated countries, and then you get to the nation-state level. In some continents, you got the sub-regional level. Then, you know, like the East African Community or the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, or ASEAN, and so on. And above that, at some point, you would reach the global scale. So we have local, national, continental, global, and the approach that we suggest is to say we accept that those levels exist. All of these levels are important in solving specific issues, and we would apply the principle of subsidiarity to identify what issues would have to be dealt with at what level of government, right? So, and at the lowest level possible, which means to a degree decentralization. If we are dealing with issues, you know, that are better dealt with at lower levels, then they should be moved there. But one thing that is often overlooked is that at the same time, subsidiarity in this case also means that some issues would have to be pushed up to higher levels of government. Let's say climate change, for instance. This is, you know, policy on climate change mitigation is a genuinely global matter. So this would have to be pushed up to the scale of global government, right? It depends, of course, the devil is always in the details, but in principle, I think that's the level where it should be. But we have no level of global government, and that's exactly the governance crisis and gap, I guess, that we are dealing with today. So, I mean, to make my response very short, we are talking about federalism, you know, and federalism means you have those multi level, you know, those levels of multi government, and that's I guess actually quite simple.
I wanted to ask just kind of a fun question on Brexit, because it's being talked about all the time, every day.
Yes.
And something interesting, I think it was about 70, 80, 90 years ago, there had previously existed this idea for an Atlantic union, I think, uniting the English-speaking nations such as Canada, USA, and Britain. If Brexit succeeds, you think Britain, in theory, could join the US someday as part of, you know, USA and Canada as part of some kind of economic and political union? I mean, what would happen with Britain?
I think Britain will be alone and on its own for a very long time. Of course, it's possible to imagine such scenarios, but I don't think that this is going to happen. Like the question also, you know, needs to be solved. What actually will happen with the UK? I mean, who says that the UK as such will even exist in 10 or 20 years' time? I mean, Scotland, for certain, in Wales, they don't necessarily see their future as part of this so-called Global Britain entity. So this is something that plays a role here. And it's interesting that you are referring to this history, because in fact, it's more than 100 years old. The idea that a world government or a world federation might be based first on a unification of all English-speaking people across the world. So this is interesting, but I don't think that it's a realistic scenario to imagine a transatlantic community around Canada, US, and Britain. I mean, I guess that a strong relationship with the remaining European Union will be a priority for, you know, in the transatlantic relationship, especially if the United Kingdom will dissolve too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so what will remain? That's little England.
I had a couple of questions on geopolitics. So if we did achieve a world parliament or a global government, you know, would there be any geopolitical contests or power struggle dynamics between the U.S. and China and Russia? What would happen in that regard within a world federation? Would that be even possible?
Right. I think we need to understand that if we talk about the concept of a world federation, we are really speaking about a very, very different scenario like we have it today. Pillars of a world legal order that would be relevant in a world federation include universally binding legislation, which is what we are working on, the establishment of a world parliament, which would do that. It would also involve worldwide arms control, including nuclear disarmament. It would, in that regard, also include the establishment of a police force. It would also mean that disputes would be settled in court, right? And not necessarily by subversive political and other means. And it also means, if we imagine a world federation, that there would be means of law enforcement through a criminal court that has universal jurisdiction, you know, a sort of international criminal court that is better developed than what we have today, and then the police. So I would argue that if we imagine a world federation, of course, political struggles, especially about redistribution of and distribution of resources, will continue. Struggles about markets will continue. Political divisions will continue. But the way how those conflicts would be dealt with would be completely different, because the risk and the underlying threat of violent conflict and war that would no longer exist, right? So we would have dispute settlement mechanisms that are obligatory, and we would deal with a situation where we have massive disarmament, ideally national armies that are ready to wage full-scale war, and mass murder wouldn't even exist anymore. So I would then compare it with a scenario like, for instance, in the United States of America, how different states pursue different interests internally, but Texas does not, threaten California with violence, and there's no inherent threat of any such thing ever to happen. So, and that's exactly, I think, what this is about, that we would move into a world order in which we use civilized ways of dealing with each other and our differences, things that we accept and take for granted at the domestic level, and which today, I mean, are not yet implemented at the global scale because it's basically still anarchic.
I guess in some ways geopolitics would become irrelevant.
Yeah, that's right. And hopefully so. That's right.
And so some of the tougher questions, I guess, regarding global government, you respond to some of the criticism in your book. And I guess, the big question, the central problem is the global Leviathan, which you talk about. If we had a system like this, the fear that it might become a totalitarian, tyrannical global state, what is the fail-safe mechanism that would prevent a world parliament from becoming a global Leviathan?
Right. I mean, this has been one of the arguments since Kant, Immanuel Kant, and in philosophy, that a world state is a risk because it might deteriorate into a global Leviathan, a suppressive regime. And I mean, there are a couple of ways to deal with this. And in today's situation, I first would like to point out or raise the question, perhaps, aren't we already in a totalitarian world state? It's just not perhaps tangible as such. Isn't it already a system of global structural violence, that we already have, but you cannot easily pinpoint the power centers and the processes that are going on? Isn't the system already serving a specific transnational elite, right? So this is, I think, one question that one needs to raise. So if we now talk about a formal, world government that might deteriorate, I would say, besides of the first argument, that there is, unfortunately, I believe, no fail-safe system at all. However, perhaps the key is to understand that we are not talking about a centralized world state, but what we are talking about, as we touched on earlier in this interview, we are talking about a system of multi-level government, which means we have subsidiarity and federalism in this system. So let's say, or let's take the example of policing and law enforcement. There certainly would not be one global law enforcement agency. But as you have it in other federal states, you would have multiple agencies and police entities at different levels. Like in the United States, you've got the National Guard at the state level, you got the county police, the sheriffs, you got then at the federal level, you have got your certain agencies. So there would not be a centralized executive of this kind. And the world executive, to a large degree, would rely on implementation of global regulation and decisions through lower scale entities. So just to follow that example further, there would not be one major centralized global army, but decentralized forces. Or in tax governance also, we would have taxes that apply globally through a global tax system, for instance, perhaps on carbon emissions or other genuinely global activities that affect everybody. This is a tax that would be decided on and implemented globally. However, perhaps regional or national tax organizations and services would have to actually take care that it's being collected and implemented, right? So even here, there's not necessarily the need to create one centralized large world agency dealing with taxation, but one perhaps that is coordinating and that it's taking care that global rules are being implemented uniformly across the planet. So I believe this is one element to understand it's a multi-level government system. And the other then finally, of course, is that one would have to, in addition to this, one would have to establish a very intelligent and resilient system of checks and balances, right? Because of course we have different branches of government that would be at play here. So we would have the executive, but we would have the legislative branch that you refer to, the World Parliament, and we would have a judicative branch, meaning that decisions being taken by other branches, they would be subject to legal review. Citizens would have to have, and other entities would have to have, the option to question and challenge certain global regulation in court. Not necessarily only global courts, but starting at the local level and then going up, and so on. So the devil is in the detail, but I think those principles will be very helpful moving forward with this idea.
You mentioned the transnational elite, and there's two things you mentioned in the book: the revolution from above and the revolution from below, which we'll talk about in a second. But first, the revolution from above. You talk about this transnational elite, the super class, the power money complex. You've mentioned as well the Bilderberg Group and the Trilateral Commission. You say that this group doesn't want a world government because they prefer the current arrangement because they can kind of float around the world and enjoy no rule of law. I mean, for them, there's no legal jurisdiction to which they must answer. There's no global power center. But you say that these current transnational elites need to get behind the idea of world government and see the logic in it, because they will be kind of like a key to get behind this. And so, I mean, what can you say about them? And then as well, would there be a way, because they have a power that influences national governments today. And so can you talk about the revolution from above, as well as, would it be possible for them to kind of influence the supranational structures of the world parliament?
Right. This is very important. First, I would like to say that certainly the transnational elite is not necessarily a uniform group. In the book, we define it. I mean, we offer many definitions put forward by others, but I think in the very core, the main indicator whether you belong to the transnational elite or not is what assets you control, directly or indirectly, financial assets. So eventually we are not necessarily talking about a large group of people, but there are concentric circles around them, people that depend on them in academia and politics, of course, in multinational corporations anyway. And this is a group that we are talking about. So let's use the example of tax evasion and analyze why would this elite tend to say we don't need and we don't want a global regulation on this, because if we have 193 entities doing their own tax systems, and of course they can play all of them against each other, and that's exactly what's happening, right? So it is they can maneuver much better in a system of 193 sovereign states compared to a system of world law that applies to them all at the same time and makes them subject to the rule of law, like you indicated. So this is just a starting point. And however, this current situation is absolutely not sustainable in many respects. I mean, parts of the transnational elite, in fact, they are building their bunkers, literally, below the earth. They are luxury bunkers because they believe that calamity is coming. And certainly that's quite right. If we look at the climate situation, you know, a world of 2, 3, 4, or 5 degrees Celsius more than today will be a very, very, you know, unlivable place to live in. And they are preparing for this. But it also grows the pressure to achieve real change that is serving the interests of the world community and world citizens at large. And I think that, you know, instances like the Occupy movement and others, they show that something is brewing there. You know, there is discontent about the so-called 0.01%, and rightfully so. So I would argue the situation is not sustainable. The pressure will grow. You know, what I referred to at the very beginning of our interview, global governance is failing, and you can see it in many, many areas, like inequality too. It's you know, skyrocketing, and you know, the difference between elite salaries and the salaries of normal workers is also, you know, the gap is skyrocketing, and so on. You can find many examples for this. So I would argue that at least some members of the transnational elite who are enlightened and who understand that eventually we are in the same boat. This is, you know, our so-called spaceship Earth. We are in the same boat, and we simply, you know, even them, they simply will have to embrace the idea of a system change if they want to avert a global revolution. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but even a global breakdown of civilization. And today, this group of people, they are those who are mainly responsible. Let's not, shy away from that fact.
Mm-hmm. And just to comment on the revolution from below, I mean, we've seen the Occupy. Right. It seems like this crescendo that just keeps building. The Occupy Wall Street, I think 2007, 8, and then 2011, the Arab Spring, and now we're seeing something I think even bigger. The scale, the yellow vests in France, which are spreading to other countries in Europe. So, I mean, will this just kind of keep getting bigger?
Yes, I mean, this is speculation, of course, and we don't know the future, but for sure, I think it's obvious that the pressure on people in many instances is growing. In developed countries, the middle classes are crushed, and certainly those who feel economically or culturally, socially insecure, they will try to find ways to express their dissatisfaction. And the yellow vests are one example in France, but we have them, I believe, everywhere. And there are waves, right? The Occupy Wall Street wave is over, but the next wave may come quite quickly, more quickly than we anticipate today. And this is certainly related to geopolitical or let's say other global developments. I mean, experts are saying that they really think the root causes of the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008 have not been addressed at all, and that the next big, meltdown of the financial and economic system might just be around the corner. So we don't know how the global population and those affected will react to such a calamity. And I believe the key really is whether those movements are, pursuing a planetary perspective. If they look at, the problem from the perspective of the whole planet, or whether they really believe in, going back to the nation state. And about the yellow vests, I'm not exactly sure what their view is in this regard, right? So the revolution from below is not necessarily a progressive revolution that will, bring us forward. It might also simply be a reactionary, regressive movement that at the end of the day actually worsens the situation if it supports nationalism. So the big challenge really is that this pressure from below uses approaches and a thinking that is cosmopolitan in nature, and that has a starting point that we need to actually empower the world's citizens, not just the citizens of some particular group. And I think we need to come to the realization that there are global social strata in development, and those who are at the bottom of the pyramid need to realize they have common interests, and this common interest is actually to build global structures and legal means to curb the transnational elite.
I just had a quick question, because we are slowly running out of time, but about the economy. So within a world government, what would you've talked about a global central bank, which I think we in some ways have. I think in Switzerland, the BIIS kind of, if I'm not mistaken, has some of those functions. We have today the dollar world reserve currency. So you talk about, we have to have a global central bank, a global currency. I know John Maynard Keynes, who was a proponent of world government, he had proposed the Bancor. Today we have the IMF's special drawing right, which is already operational. We've got the blockchain, digital currency, cryptocurrencies that are possibilities. And something interesting, I think you mentioned that Russia and China have proposed world currencies. I know former President Medvedev in 2008 proposed, there's a picture with him holding a united future world currency. And it's interesting that the two of them are rapidly accumulating gold. And so do you have any idea what would happen? Like the world dollar reserve currency would just kind of collapse, and then we would have, the IMF special drawing right. What's your thought there?
Well, I think the point is really that we need to realize that interest rate policy that is being done in the interest of national markets or national audiences in a reserve currency like the US dollar affects the whole world and economic processes across the whole world. So any national currency actually will not be able to serve that function. In that regard, I'm also doubtful whether special drawing rights that are based on a basket of national currencies are the way forward. From my point of view, it's an intermediate step only, a pragmatic step. But eventually, we will have to have some genuine global currency, in my opinion, that is independent from interest decisions taken by bodies like the European Central Bank or the Federal Reserve. It is of course hard to predict how these processes will turn out. The point that we try to make in the book is not necessarily that we propose the one or the other solution, but that we believe if it comes to such global structures, which are under discussion for a long time, or have been under discussion for a long time by experts, you mentioned it yourself, it's decades and decades. Even 100 years ago already, there was a discussion about the global currency. And I'm really convinced eventually it will come. But the whole issue with this discussion is that economists and others, they, talk about this as if it was a technical question, but it's not. It's, of course, a question that has tremendous importance, especially if it comes to global taxation and global revenues. I mean, the point is who decides this, and who provides oversight? Where is the democratic character of all of this? If we are looking at it from the perspective of today's international system, the intergovernmental organizations and bodies that we have today, they are absolutely not able to do this. So what we are actually saying is, as global economic and financial integration moves forward, and it has to move forward, this process must be accompanied by a democratic component, namely a parliamentary body that is accountable, to world citizens. It can't be done in backrooms by technical experts and diplomats. It should be a discussion that is driven and supported by a real democratic global audience. That's the point that we make. So we use it actually to support the idea that we need this a global parliament.
Just got a couple of questions left. One thing that's this question is a little bit beyond me because it goes into the realm of philosophy, but towards the end of the book, you talk about, one of the solutions towards world parliament. You've written that every new worldview in history has developed into a political project, as we saw with the Renaissance, and you write about the important aspect of the world state is the philosophy, the postmodern principles of planetary consciousness. Again, this is a little bit beyond me. So my question is, with this planetary consciousness, there's people that have a lot of different worldviews today. You talk about post-conventional values being required for world citizenship, and so what would happen with people who have different traditions or cultural values, maybe closed worldviews, religious traditions, different loyalties? How would they fit into a global structure that perhaps requires this new identity? Would they just kind of feel kind of like outsiders? What would happen there?
Right. This is actually perhaps one of the most important dimensions in this effort, because certainly we discussed that future world federation to a large degree would have to be based on voluntary agreement of all entities that are part of it, to abide by the rules that are being decided, like you have it in some existing nation states. So if this cultural and psychological foundation does not exist, it will be very hard for such a structure to function. So this relates to the need that there is a degree of global identity, a degree that is large enough to sustain a world political structure. So I'm not sure whether we are there yet. And interestingly, our political struggle for a world parliament is the best indicator where we are at. For instance, if I talk to diplomats or parliamentarians, the dividing line often is not whether they are leftist or right or conservative or green, but the dividing line is really their mindset. Have they embraced the idea that we are one planetary community, and that humanity is sharing the same, a common fate? Or are they still, in terms of their mindset, stinging to the idea we have a nation state, and the nation state is the only point of reference for anything that is being done? So while we promote politically the idea of the world parliament, we are at the same time challenging people's mindsets. So I believe over time we already have seen that people tend to more and more identify themselves as world citizens across the world, across all cultures. There is the World Value Survey project that is looking at such and other topics. How do people identify? How do they look at emancipatory values? And it seems like over the decades there is a strong movement that across the world people support this more and more. Look like yesterday or the day before yesterday, Taiwan legalized gay marriage. The Indian Supreme Court did the same. And that's just a, it shows how emancipatory freedom values that give an individual the freedom to shape his or her life as they wish without harming others are, taking root. And this is something that is important. If that does not happen to a certain level, a world parliament will not come about. Certainly it's interrelated. For instance, in Europe, without European institutions, the European currency, the Schengen area, which allows for free movement of people, without all these things, it would not be as easy as today to identify as a European, obviously. You got these European achievements and institutions, and young people growing up today in the European Union, they feel like they are EU citizens. So I believe there is an interconnection between how institutions are being developed and how the consciousness and identity develops. So if we talk about the UN Parliamentary Assembly, I believe it would be, a step to help in the development of a understanding of global citizenship. Imagine the value, even if it's just a consultative body, or later, the value of having a body that you can elect as a world citizen wherever you are. Global elections. That is, in my view, something that would push an understanding as global citizens worldwide. So, right, we will have to do a little first steps. And now just one last dimension of what you asked. You will never be able to have a uniform understanding of identity anywhere. Even in the United States, for instance, you will find fringe groups that do not identify with the federal government of the United States, or who use, some kind of group identity to exclude everybody else, like white supremacists. And such groups will always be a problem. And I assume they will continue to exist in one way or another. But certainly moving forward is not dependent on their approval. But what we need is really a large majority of those people who do feel empathy and who do want the common good of all. And that's something that certainly will be necessary. And one last aspect. Certainly, it is possible to feel as a global citizen, as a citizen of your region, and a citizen of your nation, and a citizen of your, other group at the same time, right? So you can be a global citizen and, somebody else at the same time. This is quite clear. So I don't think that an exclusionary approach is necessary. And so far, I'm optimistic that this will actually move forward over time.
Just another question that interests me. The first two world organizations, League of Nations and the UN, were born out of great global catastrophes, the First World War, the Second World War. And you mentioned briefly in your book, there's the danger that the third generation world organization, there's a danger that we might have another greater war. And right now, where you see the United States just behaving erratically in Iran and Venezuela, and there's this fear that they might start some great conflagration. Can you just comment on the fear of, the third generation world organization, this world parliament, being born out of something like another great war?
Yes, it is true that these are really very, very troubling times. I don't know, we might be in the worst situation since the Second World War, in my opinion, if it comes to the risk of some global calamity. Look at the suspension of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, for instance, or many other elements that are relevant now in this regard, but also other areas that we touched on, like the climate crisis, financial instability, and that. So the problem is that we cannot certainly accept the need of third calamity, because the situation is that this might certainly be the last. It might be a catastrophe of a dimension that would lead to a complete, or at least very substantial, breakdown of human civilization. Even a limited nuclear war might have such consequences in the mid-run, if you consider its impact on the climate and with weather and agriculture and so on. So this is something we simply cannot accept. So the big challenge, which has never been achieved before, is that we have to build a global consciousness and an understanding of global citizens a planetary worldview without this third calamity, right? We need to anticipate the danger and the potential consequences now and act in anticipation to avoid it and to build world structures that will help to make it impossibility in the long run. I mean, humanity has still a long time to live on this planet if we do it right, if we accept planetary boundaries, and if we have the systems in place to manage planetary boundaries. Millions of years, actually. So this is something we really need to recognize. And on the other hand, it is quite sure that we will have to deal with catastrophes, but they might be of a smaller scale, yes? Like a global financial crisis, a second one. And I believe those who embrace the idea of planetary citizenship, they need to build networks now. They need to think about now, what can we do and what can we achieve if that moment comes that shakes up the world. And then we need to be ready to seize the moment and achieve a civilizational leap forward, the leap that we need to avoid this breakdown.
My final question before I give you the last word, because it's just interesting stuff in this book, so people can go out and check it out, buy it in Kindle, electronic version or the physical copy. The last thing that kind of I was surprised, you've written that hardly any autocratic regime survives when the per capita income reaches $6,000 US. And surely we've seen in China, the middle class just explode, hundreds of millions of people just raised out of poverty. And you've written, just this is kind of like out of left field for me, that the chance that China might lead the way toward global government by democratizing itself. And you say that in fact plans are already being laid down to democratize China. Just a thought on that.
Right. I mean, you know, many people, they look at the West and the global North if they wish to pursue innovation in terms of global governance reforms and democratic, steps forward. But my experience is that the Western elite and politicians, they are really intellectually worn out. They enjoy privileges that have been built over decades, and they are not the ones who are actually thinking about innovation. And they are also, by the way, as a rule, there are exceptions, but as a rule, they are not interested in ideas like a global parliament. Well, the Chinese are not interested in that either, the Communist Party. Let's be clear about that. It's a dictatorship that is right now confining 1.3 million Uyghurs in camps. It's a very, very terrible regime, and a regime that we should resist as best as we can. However, the point that we try to make in the book is that change is happening, and it might be happening, and perhaps China, a new China that has gone through a democratic revolution, might be exactly the place where fresh thinking comes from in terms of the global order. Interestingly, Mikhail Gorbachev, for instance, he offered fresh thinking in terms of how to change the global order in 1987 to 1991 and beyond, but then he no longer was in his political position. So there is a tendency that revolutionary governments support revolutionary ideas. And we don't know what scenario will play out in China. Talking to Chinese dissidents and labor rights activists in Hong Kong and elsewhere, for instance, they tell me that the big oppression that is now taking place in China is actually a sign of weakness on part of the Communist Party. What they are doing is, establishing the social scoring system, or the confinement that I mentioned in the, of the Uyghurs in the north, and other things, total surveillance. All these things are a sign of weakness. And who knows? I mean, nobody anticipated that the Berlin Wall would fall and that the Soviet Union would dissolve. Nobody anticipated the Arab Spring in 2011. And in fact, there are little uprisings in China all the time. We just don't know about it. And at some point, my hope really is that the Communist Party's power will be broken and will be replaced by a multi-party democratic system. And now imagine a new democratic Chinese government that would push for global democracy. Who could resist that, right? So we shouldn't look at the United States or such countries for democratic change to happen. It might happen, certainly, a new government starting 2020 that replaces Trump. Who knows what it's going to do to make good of what's going badly right now. But I think in our mindset, we should be open for surprises that we cannot foresee.
Correction, I believe it was Johann Galtung who I've interviewed, one of my, I guess, most popular interviews, who did predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. Any final thought or word from you? Anything you'd like to leave us with message?
Well, yes. I mean, what I could do is I can say that anyone who is listening or viewing to this podcast, an interview, is very welcome to become part of this effort of promoting planetary citizenship, planetary worldview, and of course, planetary institutions like a democratic world parliament. So I believe this will only function anticipating the catastrophe and avoiding it if we are many and if we are at the right places at the right time. And you are very welcome to be part of this.
And I'll put the links in the description, but can you just briefly mention you're on Twitter, you have websites, where can people best follow the work and the different programs that you participate in?
Right. I would recommend, if you are at Twitter, to follow the Twitter account of Democracy Without Borders, which is the key organization that is pushing for several campaigns. For instance, the campaign for UN Parliamentary Assembly, and the handle is Democracy WB.
Okay. And check out the book once again.
Oh, yes.
And yeah, thanks again. People check out the websites, the Twitter, and it was great speaking with you, Andreas. Danke.
Thanks again for having me. It was a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platforms such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.